When the Epstein files started trending again, I noticed something interesting. No one my age seemed shocked, not outraged in a dramatic way, not stunned, not wide-eyed, just tired. It wasn't that people didn't care. It was that most of us expected something like this, and that reaction says more about our generation than the headlines themselves. I'm in my mid-20s. I grew up online. I grew up watching political scandals unfold in real time on my phone. I grew up seeing powerful people get exposed, deny everything, apologize if necessary, and then move on. So when court documents get unsealed, when names trend, when media panels debate what it all means, my generation doesn't gasp. We scroll, not because it's normal, but because it feels predictable. The Epstein case, at its core, was about power, about who has it, about who gets protected by it, about who doesn't. And if you're Gen Z, you've grown up watching that pattern repeat over and over again across different industries and different scandals. We've seen corporations settle lawsuits without admitting wrongdoing. We've seen politicians survive investigations. We've seen executives walk away with bonuses while workers get laid off. So when people say, "Can you believe this?" a lot of us can. That's the uncomfortable truth. The reason Gen Z isn't surprised isn't because we're cynical for fun. It's because we've been trained by experience. Think about the timeline we grew up in. We were kids during the 2008 financial crisis. We watched banks collapse, saw headlines about bailouts, and then watched many of the same institutions recover faster than regular families did. We entered high school and college during nonstop political polarization. We watched social media amplify every scandal within minutes. We saw information move faster than accountability. And we saw powerful institutions constantly promise transparency, while rarely delivering full closure. So when the Epstein files resurface in public discussion, Gen Z doesn't treat it as an isolated event. We see it as part of a larger pattern, a pattern where wealth, influence, and access seem to operate by different rules. Now, to be clear, the Epstein case itself involves serious criminal charges and tragic harm. And those facts matter. Court proceedings happened, convictions happened, investigations happened. Those are documented realities. But what lingers in the public mind isn't just the crimes. It's the unanswered questions. It's the connections to powerful figures across politics, business, and media. It's the perception that the elite world operates in ways ordinary people never see. And perception matters, because trust is fragile, and Gen Z's trust in institutions is already low. Surveys consistently show that younger Americans have significantly less confidence in government, corporations, media, and even the justice system compared to older generations. That didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, and the Epstein files didn't create that distrust, they reinforced it. Here's the key point. For many older Americans, scandals like this feel shocking because they disrupt an assumption that institutions generally work as intended. For Gen Z, the assumption has already shifted. We don't start from a place of full trust. We start from cautious skepticism. So when documents get released and headlines explode, the reaction isn't disbelief. It's confirmation of what we already suspected. That powerful networks exist. That access to power changes outcomes. That influence isn't evenly distributed. And that transparency often arrives slowly, partially, and under pressure. This isn't about partisan politics. It's not about defending or attacking one side. The Epstein case touched people across the political spectrum. And that's exactly why it hit differently for Gen Z. Because it reinforced the idea that power protects itself regardless of party label. When you grow up watching that, you don't get shocked anymore. You get analytical. You start asking bigger questions. How do elite networks form? Why does wealth concentrate around the same circles? Why does accountability seem uneven? Why does transparency require public pressure? And those questions don't stop at one case. They spill over into how we think about politics, economics, and media in general. If you're my age, you've probably had conversations that sound like this. Of course there were powerful connections. Of course there are names people don't want released. Of course the full story takes years to surface. not because we know secret information, but because we've internalized how modern power structures tend to operate. And that's why the biggest story isn't the shock value, it's the normalization. Gen Z isn't surprised by the Epstein files because we don't view powerful institutions as inherently self-correcting. We view them as systems that respond to pressure. That difference in mindset changes everything. And in the next part, I want to break down exactly how growing up online shaped this perspective. Why information access made Gen Z more skeptical than previous generations, and how this shift is quietly reshaping American political culture. I think a big part of this comes down to how my generation consumes information. We didn't grow up waiting for the evening news. We grew up refreshing timelines. When something happens now, we don't just see one headline. We see screenshots, old interviews, archive clips, legal documents, commentary threads, podcasts, and opposing takes all at once. Information doesn't arrive neatly packaged. It arrives messy, contradictory, incomplete. And that constant exposure trains you to read between the lines. So when documents connected to a high-profile case get released, Gen Z doesn't just absorb the headline. We immediately start looking at timelines. Who knew what and when? Who had access? Who distanced themselves? Who stayed quiet? That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from growing up during an era where major stories kept evolving after the first report. We've seen situations where early narratives change weeks later. We've watched viral clips leave out context. We've seen institutions make confident statements and then quietly revise them. So our default mode is skepticism, not shock. And that mindset directly shapes how we react to cases like this one. Another difference is that Gen Z doesn't view powerful figures as distant. Social media collapsed that distance. Politicians post selfies. CEOs host live streams. Public figures tweet directly. When you grow up watching influential people act casually online, the illusion of untouchable authority weakens. They feel human, which also means they feel fallible. So when serious allegations or court documents emerge involving powerful individuals, the idea that elite circles might overlap doesn't feel outrageous. It feels plausible. That doesn't mean guilt is assumed. It means proximity to power is no longer mystified. And that shift matters because previous generations often placed institutions on pedestals. Government agencies were presumed neutral. Major media outlets were presumed objective. Corporate leaders were presumed competent. Gen Z grew up watching those assumptions get challenged repeatedly. We saw misinformation spread. We saw public trust metrics decline. We saw partisan battles over basic facts. And through all of that, we learned one thing. Institutions are run by people with incentives, people with reputatio, and to protect, people with careers on the line. That awareness doesn't automatically create distrust, but it does eliminate blind trust. So when the Epstein files re-enter public discussion, it doesn't feel like a singular shocking event. It feels like another example in a long series of stories involving wealth, influence, and access. There's also the timing factor. Gen Z entered adulthood during a period of economic instability, political division, and social upheaval. We graduated into recessions. We started careers during a pandemic. We watched markets swing wildly. We saw emergency policies roll out overnight. When you grow up during constant disruption, your threshold for shock gets higher. You evaluate patterns. And that's exactly how many young adults approach the Epstein documents, not with disbelief, but with pattern recognition. Powerful person. It's a formula we've seen in different forms before. And again, this isn't about claiming hidden knowledge. It's about understanding how repeated exposure shapes expectations. When you see enough stories where accountability unfolds slowly and imperfectly, you stop assuming swift resolution. You expect process. You expect legal battles. You expect partial disclosures. And you expect public debate about what transparency should look like. That's the mindset Gen Z brings into moments like this. Another factor is how comfortable my generation is with ambiguity. We live in gray areas constantly. Online, you're exposed to multiple viewpoints at the same time. There's rarely a single narrative that dominates for long. So instead of immediately choosing outrage or disbelief, many of us default to cautious observation. We read, we watch how institutions respond. That patience can look like apathy from the outside. It's watching how power behaves under scrutiny. And that's why the phrase Gen Z isn't surprised doesn't mean we're numb. It means we're accustomed to complexity. We don't assume the system always functions cleanly. We assume it functions within incentives. That perspective is critical, because once you start viewing institutions through the lens of incentives instead of idealism, you react differently to major revelations. You ask who benefits from transparency, who benefits from delay, who benefits from silence, and who bears the consequences. Those questions go far beyond one case. They shape how Gen Z thinks about politics in general, about corporate power, about media framing, about legal systems. And in the next part, I want to explore how this generational skepticism is influencing political engagement, voting behavior, and long-term trust in American institutions. So what does all of this actually lead to? If Gen Z isn't shocked, if we're skeptical by default, what does that do to how we engage with politics? From what I've seen in my own friend group, it doesn't make us disengaged, it makes us selective. A lot of people assume young voters are apathetic, but that's not really accurate. Turnout among young voters has fluctuated, sure, but political conversation among Gen Z is constant. It's just happening in different spaces, group chats, comment sections, private Discord servers, short-form videos. Instead of watching cable news, we're watching breakdowns from independent creators, reading primary documents when we can, and comparing interpretations across platforms. That doesn't mean every take is perfect, but it does mean authority is no longer centralized. And that's a big shift. When the Epstein files resurface, older generations might look to a few major outlets for interpretation. Gen Z looks everywhere. Mainstream coverage, legal analysts on YouTube, threads summarizing timelines, clips of press, conferences. We build a picture from fragments. And because we're used to assembling narratives ourselves, we don't wait for one institution to tell us what to think. That independence is empowering, but it also comes with consequences. When trust in traditional gatekeepers declines, people rely more heavily on peer networks, and peer networks are influenced by algorithms, so skepticism can sometimes amplify faster than resolution. If something looks inconsistent, it spreads. If something feels hidden, speculation fills the gap. That environment doesn't create surprise. It creates expectation that more details will always emerge later. And when expectations are calibrated that way, revelations feel less like bombs and more like confirmations. Another impact is how Gen Z views bipartisan power. The Epstein case connected individuals across political lines, industries, and social circles. That cross-ideological proximity reinforced something many young voters already believed. That elite networks often transcend party labels. So when older commentators frame scandals in strictly partisan terms, it doesn't fully resonate with us. We're more likely to ask who benefits structurally, not just which party is embarrassed. That lens changes political alignment. It pushes some people toward anti-establishment candidates. It pushes others toward reform movements. It pushes some toward disengagement. But the common thread is skepticism of centralized power, not necessarily rejection of democracy, but rejection of blind loyalty. In conversations I've had with coworkers and friends, the reaction to stories like this isn't "this proves my side was right." It's more like, "This is why I don't fully trust any side." That mindset can be healthy if it encourages critical thinking. It can also be destabilizing if it turns into permanent cynicism. And that's the tension my generation lives in. We want accountability, but we've seen enough partial accountability to question how deep it really goes. We want transparency, but we've seen how slow and negotiated transparency can be. We want institutions that work, but we've grown up watching those institutions defend themselves first. That's why the Epstein files land differently for Gen Z. They don't shatter an illusion. They reinforce a pre-existing worldview. A worldview shaped by constant exposure to scandal cycles, constant exposure to leaked documents, constant exposure to debates about power. There's also a cultural factor here. Gen Z humor is layered with irony. Memes appear within minutes of major news events, not because people think the situation is funny, but because humor is how our generation processes overload. When the world feels unstable or morally complicated, irony becomes a coping mechanism. So the absence of visible shock doesn't equal indifference. It often equals fatigue. Fatigue from years of watching institutions respond slowly. Fatigue from seeing accountability debated endlessly. Fatigue from headlines that feel cyclical. And fatigue can look like emotional distance. But underneath that distance is attention. We're paying attention. We're just not surprised. That difference matters politically, because surprise motivates outrage. But skepticism motivates reform. When you assume institutions are imperfect by default, you stop waiting for perfection and start looking for structural change. You ask bigger questions about transparency laws, about campaign finance, about how information is released to the public, about oversight mechanisms. That's where generational change happens, not necessarily in viral reactions, but in long-term expectations about how power should behave. And in the final part, I want to talk about where this mindset could lead over the next decade, and whether Gen Z's skepticism becomes constructive reform or permanent distrust. So where does all of this leave us if Gen Z isn't surprised by the Epstein files? If we approach major scandals with skepticism instead of shock, what happens next? I don't think the answer is that we disengage completely. I also don't think the answer is that we spiral into permanent distrust. What I see around me is something more complicated. It's a generation that no longer assumes institutions deserve automatic trust, but still wants them to work. That distinction matters, because there's a difference between cynicism and accountability. Cynicism says nothing will ever change, so why bother? Accountability says systems can improve, but only if they're pressured to do so. And if you look closely, Gen Z tends to lean toward pressure, not apathy. We sign petitions. We organize online. We amplify stories that feel underreported. We debate policy details in comment sections that older generations might never even see. We may not always trust traditional institutions, but we absolutely engage with public life. The Epstein case and the documents connected to it didn't create that mindset. They reinforced it. They became another data point in a long line of examples. That taught us to look at power through incentives, through networks, through accountability mechanisms, instead of personalities alone. That's a fundamental shift. For decades, American political culture relied heavily on trust in office holders and gatekeepers. News anchors were trusted. Institutions were respected by default. Scandals were treated as rare disruptions. Gen Z came of age in a period where disruption was constant. So instead of viewing power as stable, we view it as dynamic and responsive to pressure. That perspective can be uncomfortable for people who prefer certainty, but it can also be healthy. Because when you expect transparency, you demand it. When you expect accountability, you track it. And when you don't assume that power corrects itself automatically, you participate more actively in shaping it. There's also a personal layer to this. As someone who followed the traditional path, college, internships, corporate job, I was raised to believe institutions were merit-based and self-correcting. Work hard, play by the rules, trust the process. But adulthood taught me that systems are influenced by incentives, relationships, and leverage. That realization wasn't radical, it was gradual. And stories like the Epstein case simply accelerated that understanding for a lot of people my age. Not because we think everything is corrupt, but because we've seen enough complexity to know it isn't simple. So when older commentators ask, why Gen Z isn't reacting with shock, the answer isn't apathy. It's experience with information moving fast, experience with institutions responding under pressure, experience with partial transparency, experience with contradictions. We're not surprised because we've learned to expect gray areas. And that expectation doesn't have to destroy trust completely. It can reshape it. Instead of loyalty to personalities, loyalty to processes. Instead of outrage cycles, long-term scrutiny. That's where I think this goes. Gen Z isn't walking away from civic life. We're redefining how we relate to it. We're less impressed by titles, more focused on documentation, less swayed by press conferences, more attentive to timelines, more interested in patterns. That shift won't transform politics overnight, but over the next decade, it could change expectations about transparency, oversight, and accountability. If enough young voters consistently demand clarity, vote based on structural issues, and reward institutions that demonstrate openness, incentives begin to shift. Systems adapt to pressure. They always have. The real question isn't whether Gen Z is surprised. It's whether our skepticism turns into constructive engagement. Because skepticism without participation becomes isolation, but skepticism paired with engagement becomes reform. That choice matters. For me, acknowledging that powerful networks exist doesn't mean giving up. It means paying attention. It means asking better questions. It means supporting policies that increase transparency and reduce concentration of power. It means staying informed without assuming every story is either pure outrage or pure innocence. It means understanding that institutions are human-built and therefore capable of both failure and improvement. So no, Gen Z isn't surprised by the Epstein files, but that lack of surprise isn't numbness. It's awareness. Awareness shaped by growing up in an era where information is constant and power is scrutinized in real time. And if we channel that awareness productively through voting, organizing, informed debate, and consistent pressure, then skepticism becomes a strength instead of a weakness. That's the opportunity in front of us, not to retreat, not to disengage, but to demand better systems with clearer incentives and stronger accountability. If you're my age and you feel that same mix of fatigue and focus, you're not alone. We didn't lose our sense of justice. We just stopped being surprised, and maybe that's the first step toward building institutions that actually earn our trust. Thanks for watching. If this resonated with you, share your perspective in the comments. I read them. And if you want more breakdowns of how power, money, and institutions shape our generation's future, subscribe. I'll keep approaching these topics the same way, calmly, critically, and with the goal of building something more stable than what we inherited.